Once Upon a Christmas Time by Thyra Ferré Bjorn. Chapter 2. Following the 13th of December, with the warm glow of the beautiful saint still in our thoughts, the great preparations began for the fast approaching holidays. One of the first of these was the making of hundreds and hundreds of cookies. These were baked early in the month, placed in tightly covered tins, and stored in the cold earth cellar, not to be opened until the afternoon of the day before Christmas, when, according to old tradition, folks were allowed to taste them for the first time. So embedded was this in our minds that we children never even asked for a cookie, no matter how good they looked to us. I smile to myself now as I wander back in time. What a perfect tradition that was. I wonder if it wasn't some old granny who came up with it in the beginning to keep her cookies safe from both children and adults. It was handy to have as a threat, the dark omen that terrible things would happen to the individual or to the household if the tradition were broken. Very, very early on the baking morning, housewives would leave their warm beds, tiptoeing softly so as not to awaken the rest of the household. Bracing themselves, they would go down into the ice-cold kitchen, where thick frost flowers had formed on the window panes, and they would scrape off a little and look out into the dense darkness, hoping that there would be a tiny sliver of a new moon in the sky, because nothing else would give better luck to the baking procedure. The white vapor from their own breath was visible before the fire was lit in the black wood stove that would soon give out plenty of heat. How quickly the fire began to burn since all the preparations had been made the night before. There was dry bark in a pile beside the logs, and perhaps, if the household were lucky, there were a few tire sticks. This wood had in it a certain substance that made the fire flare up quickly and ignite the small white logs. It was a matter of careful planning, and every Swedish housewife took pride in being efficient. Carefully trained by her mother in all household tasks, each woman strove to be the best and most clever of all. Soon the kitchen began to take on a feeling of warmth and hominess as the copper coffee pot began to bubble while the oven was heating, and many different doughs were being mixed. Each cookie was a unique creation, from an unwritten recipe which was followed step by step. I never remember Mama having anything written down on paper. It was all committed to memory. She took just so much of this and so much of that. There was just so much time for mixing, so many strokes with a wire whisk. It was done the same way year after year, and nothing was ever changed or forgotten. As the glowing fire warmed the big kitchen, a bit of heathendom lurked in the dark corners. How long it had existed, no one seemed to know. Few housewives ever reflected on the reason they baked so early in the morning. It had always been that way. Their mothers before them and their grandmothers and great-grandmothers had all arisen at this unearthly hour to begin the Christmas cookie baking. But the old story lady could tell us that it had started way back in the Dark Ages. The baking of fancy things at this darkest time of the year began when the cookies were made to celebrate the Festival of the Lights, which was held annually to drive away the spirits of darkness and to appease the gods who held the powers of good and evil for the people and the land. It was the gods who had proclaimed and made it an established rule that no sunlight should shine on this dough. If it did, disaster would fall on the household and its people. I have a feeling that this tradition has been almost completely done away with in modern Sweden, but tales are still told of how it used to be long, long ago. How well I remember my own Mama getting up at 4 o'clock on those December mornings to do her baking, and I am sure she never thought of it as a curse. To her it was an exciting time, filled with fun and eagerness to begin. "How many kinds of cookies will you bake this Christmas?" one housewife would ask another. And the answer would come, "This year I am only baking 17 kinds of cookies and a pepperkaka." And another wife would proudly proclaim, "This year I am baking 29 kinds of cookies and a mädelskåpor." Mädelskåpor was a rusk with almonds in it, and pepparkaka was a very special ginger cake. They too belonged to the Christmas baking, but they were not cookies, and they had to be classified in a separate category. The housewives just loved to outdo each other when it came to Christmas baking and the many varieties of cookies they could make. So in this early hour, when the smoke rose straight toward the sky from the tall chimney, busy hands were chopping nuts and orange peel and crunching sugar from the big sugar pyramid. Few thought of it as work. It was fun to make ready and bake the fancy creations for the household and the many guests that would visit during the gay holidays. Perhaps in their minds the housewives could already hear the sleigh bells outside and the eager feet stamping off snow at the doorstep, the firm knock on the front door, and the hearty greetings. Then would come the time to fill the plates with cookies and fancy breads and to smell the aroma of coffee bubbling on the stove. That would be the time to sit and chat while the guests lingered long during those lazy days when little work needed to be done. They must have thought also of the wide, shining blue eyes of the children as the goodies were placed in piles, one for each child. They would be one of every cookie, regardless of how many kinds that had been baked. The mothers made the piles before going to church early on Christmas morning, and afterwards each child could eat to his heart's content. To make the family feel happy and important was the duty and responsibility of the housewife. It was her task. It was her joy. That was what she lived for, and most importantly, was pleasing her husband who, after all, was the head of the household. Yes, there was mixing and scraping and beating and the spreading of jams and preserves. No matter how meager the household budget, at Christmas time there was no skimping. Everything that went into the baking must be the finest quality. That was a must for the once-a-year cookie spree. Busy fingers cut and shaped the many doughs into breathtaking creations. There was always the traditional Christmas buck, commemorating the ancients' worship of Thor, the god of strength and thunder, who had ridden through the skies with his two great bucks. There were also Christmas angels and stars in honor of Bethlehem. And of course, the Santa Clauses made in the image of our own beloved Tomte. Christmas logs and half-moons, oak leaves and rings, S-shaped cookies and braided wreaths, and many, many more began to emerge on the baking trays. The bucks and Santas were made large enough to hang on the Christmas tree, as were the gingerbread mamas and papas. But before the actual baking took place, the stove had to be completely cleaned and the kitchen had to be spotless. No person other than the housewife could be in the kitchen during the baking time. This tradition was freely broken in our parsonage, and it had loosened up in many homes despite the dark omens. I was allowed to help Mama and arise when she did in the early morning, perhaps because I was such a persistent child. Oh, to capture it again, just for one moment, the feeling that tingled through me when on a certain morning in dark December, a familiar aroma drifted to my nostrils, penetrating my deep slumber. It was different from anything else in the whole world, the aroma of cookies baking in the oven. I knew then that Christmas was not far away, because at no other time did Mama bake cookies at that hour of the morning. I counted on her good nature when I went against the rules and entered the kitchen. First, I would stand a few seconds outside the door. Then I would push it open ever so slowly. Peeking in, I would get my first glimpse of Mama rushing about in her own kingdom. She would be rosy-cheeked and starry-eyed, humming softly the tune of a morning hymn. There was always a speck of flour on the tip of her nose, and invariably she would smile at me. How I loved to go from one pile of cookies to the next. They were all over the kitchen, in every available space, like little mountains, and each more beautiful than the one before. After some hesitation, Mama would let me help, and to be trusted with placing the cookies in the tins was the most wonderful experience that could come to a young girl. They had to be handled carefully, as the thinnest crystal or china. They were that brittle, and to break one would be a terrible crime. So I lifted them one by one. Mama had taught me to handle her creations just so. The finska bröd were my favorites. I called them the miracle cookies. I loved to watch Mama's skillful hands mix the flour crumbs in a smooth dough, which she would roll into yard lengths, no wider than her ring finger. She cut them into the right size pieces, a couple of inches long, brushed them with egg white, that had been beaten into a fluff. Then they were carefully dipped in coarse sugar and nuts, which had to be finely chopped. They always cracked on the top a little when they baked, as though they were bursting with goodness. I did try once to measure Mama's so much of this and so much of that, although she said it was easier to remember. You took twice as much flour as butter, and the same in tablespoons of sugar as in cups of flour. So measuring it out, it came out to something like this. This made a great many cookies, and half the recipe is enough for the average family. This morning baking would continue until all the cookies had been put away. The rest of the baking had to wait until nearer Christmas, to be fresh for day before Christmas afternoon coffee. Then again, the early morning bakings would begin. The yeast dough was set at night so that it would be ready to bake in the morning. It was bundled up in a woolen blanket or towels to keep it warm, and sometimes newspapers were wrapped around the blanket. The rye bread was baked first. There was a special vertlimpa for Christmas made with syrup and delicious spices. It was made into many loaves, some round and some flat, to be used for the dipping in the pot at noon on Christmas Eve. I can remember Mama taking the beautiful loaves out of the oven and how the aroma filled the whole house with Christmas fragrance. She brushed them quickly with syrup water to make them shiny. Sometimes the flatbread was mixed with wheat flour to make it look extra light. The coffee bread was made of lavish amounts of sugar and butter. There were long braided loaves, little round twisted buns, and the pretzel-shaped ones called kringlor. But I liked the clipped crowns the best, and how I loved to watch Mama make them. Clipped crowns were just coffee bread dough that was rolled out flat like a cookie dough, then spread with lots of butter and sprinkled with sugar. Sometimes it would be spread with almond paste or preserves or raisins and nuts, whichever suited the cook at the time. Then it was rolled into a ring, large or small according to the size of the family. Ours was always a great big one. Then it would be cut with the scissors all across the top. The baker just snip and cut any old way. After it had risen to twice its original size, it was brushed with egg white and sprinkled with coarse sugar and slivered almonds. It was baked in a moderate oven and proved to be the choicest of all coffee bread. Or maybe I feel that way because of my childhood memories. Now, if a wife wanted to be really fancy in her baking, she would make, in addition to all the other breads, some wienerbrød. This was a Danish pastry, and it had to be made on the morning of the day before Christmas, because it tasted good only if it was newly baked. And what a treat to have it for early morning coffee. Mama would take these ingredients. She would dump the flour onto the baking board in a heap and make a hole in the middle. Into this hole she would break the egg, crumble the yeast cakes, and pour in the sugar. Then, spilling a small amount of milk into the mixture, she would stir it slowly with a fork, adding a little more milk from time to time until all was mixed in. Then she would sprinkle more flour on the board and roll the dough flat with a rolling pin. She would spread it with butter and fold it over and over until the butter was all rolled in. Then she would cut it into strips and twist them to make pretzel-shaped buns. She would let them rise to twice their size and bake them in a hot oven, 400 degrees, until they were light brown. As soon as they came out of the oven, they were spread with a paste made of 2 tablespoons of milk, 2 tablespoons of powdered sugar. This hardened into a lovely glaze and made a pastry fit for a queen to eat at any time. That was Christmas baking as I remember it from my own once upon a time. There was a certain mystery about it and an excitement different from anything else in a child's mind. In it, the good of the land was shared in the togetherness of family life. After all, didn't the baking ingredients come from the crops, from the fields that in the fall were heavy with grain? It tied together like a beautiful wreath all the things that belonged to Christmas, and tradition was the big red bow that put the finishing touch on all the work. The sakaka, the sewing loaf, was a very special bread always baked at Christmas time. It contained all the goodness which could be put into it, and sometimes it was a mixture of many kinds of flours. It was a big round loaf, not to be eaten, but to be saved for spring when the sowing took place. Sometimes the loaf was reduced to fine crumbs and mixed with the seeds. Sometimes it was broken into pieces and plowed right into the earth. It was believed that this would bring blessings and good luck to the soil in which the seed was sown, and that it would mean a prosperous harvest. Faithfully, year after year, generation after generation, the farm people lovingly and generously prepared this loaf of bread that would bring joy and prosperity and blessings. I am sorry to think that the years have destroyed this tradition, that our modern times have erased the value of it. Now the only remembrance of it, and many others, is in the stories told of how it used to be, when the welfare of the home and loved ones meant more to people than anything else in the world.